frozen eternity.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this month, Friday, the 24th of February's live broadcast of the Revelation Show here with me, your host, Paul Stevenson. Welcome to the show, wherever you are around the world. We're going out live. It's 2 to 4 Eastern Standard Time and 7 to 9 p.m. here in the UK. And I have coming up in a minute, I'm going to introduce our guest. I'm delighted to say that we have Marcus Papadopoulos with us. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And Marcus is the publisher and editor of Politics First magazine, which is a non-partisan publication for the British government. He is also a regular television and radio commentator, which is where I came across him. I think it was an RT, specialising in Russia and the rest of the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, Syria, and British politics. He holds a PhD in Russian Soviet history from Royal Holloway University in London. Are you with me, Marcus?
Good evening, Paul, and I'm delighted to be on your program tonight.
I'm delighted that you're here, and thank you very much. As I mentioned, I came across you. I think it was an RT, Marcus. I know I did see an RT on Peter Lavelle's Crosstalk earlier in the week, which I'm a regular viewer of.
Yes. Right.
And it certainly seems to me, anyway, that you do get some real journalism on a network like RT. It tends to be a lot more balanced and fair, and seems to me anyway to reflect much more of the reality, and will be a lot more consistent with some of the alternative news networks where increasingly more people are turning to for information rather than the tired old propaganda coming out of Western mainstream media networks.
Yes, I concur with that 100%. RT has done an outstanding job since 2005, when it was launched, in challenging the Western narrative of events around the world. And by challenging the Western narrative, RT has been extremely successful in exposing the double standards and exposing the folly and the danger of Western foreign policy. And I would say that RT's coverage of events in Libya in 2011, the conflict in Syria, which of course started also in 2011, events in Ukraine, in particular the overthrow of President Yanukovych, a democratically elected leader who was overthrown in a Western-backed coup, and then what happened in the Crimea and then the Donbass. RT has really shown Western foreign policy to be deceitful, to be all about maintaining American global hegemony. And more people in Britain and in the wider world are starting to question what the British government says and what the American government says. And I really do believe that a lot of that is due to RT. And I would add this as well. In the 1990s, we needed an RT, but we didn't have one. There was no alternative media at that point. There was obviously no social media. And even though I was very, very young in the 1990s, I remember being extremely frustrated by how the West was behaving in the Yugoslav civil wars in Croatia and Bosnia, and then the bombing of Serbia in 1999. There were so many questions that I had. There were so many inaccuracies from Western media, for example, and what Western politicians were saying. And I ended up sort of, just talking to myself while watching the wretched BBC News and the wretched CNN News and the likes. But there was no TV network. There was no RT at that time. for example, to convey the views I had and to ask the questions which I was asking. So, even though in 2017, Western media remains formidable, there's no question about it. Its power is formidable. It is weakened. More and more people are questioning what they see on Fox News or CNN or Sky News. And it's certainly the case that Western media does not have the feel to itself like it once did in the 1990s.
Yes, absolutely. And, as I say, I mean, we're seeing this, of course, with Trump, where we have this disparity between the far left establishment media and public opinion. And, I mean, it's just been Russia obsession. And of course, Trump has uttered the blasphemy of even just suggesting that he might have a better relationship and asking the question, wouldn't it be good if we could have good relationships with Russia? And he has to ask it in that way, because the whole, particularly in the US, the demonization of Trump is of Putin is so deeply ingrained that it's just an automatic response that Putin and the Russian Federation must be an enemy.
Yes, I mean, I would say this, that the media in America is divided between neoliberals and neocons. I would never describe them as far left. I mean, no chance. I mean, the neoliberals, for example, CNN or the Washington Post. I mean, they have as much in common with left-wing ideas, socialist ideas, as Ian Paisley Sr. had with the Vatican. I mean, they just don't have anything in common with them. And I would also say that neoliberals and neocons, they are just as dangerous, they are just as malignant, and they have caused equal carnage around the world, and they have devastated the lives of many, many people, and in particular in the former Yugoslavia and in Iraq and in Syria, and also in Ukraine. And I would add a reservation about Donald Trump. Donald Trump said a lot of things during his campaign, and he said a lot of things to simply try and pick a fight with the establishment, to try and stand himself out as being different. The reality, of course, is that he's not so different. He's always been a part of the American elite, not the political elite, of course, but the business elite. And what a politician says during a campaign is not necessarily what he or she is going to deliver if they are elected. And we have to hold Donald Trump to what he's saying now as president, not what he said during the campaign. Because remember, during the campaign, he said that Hillary Clinton is a vile woman and she should go to prison. And I agree, she is a vile woman. But now Donald Trump has said that Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton are good people, and he may need to call upon them for advice during his presidency. And in regard to Russia, well, what has he said as president so far? Well, first of all, he said that Russia took the Crimea and needs to return it back to Ukraine. He has also said that Russia is responsible for the escalation of violence in the Donbass. He has also said that Russia is in violation of the INF Treaty. He has also acknowledged that Russia interfered in the American presidential election last year. And of course, most recently, he said that he wants the American nuclear arsenal to be the largest and the most powerful in the world. Well, that is a way of undermining treaties in existence at the moment between America and Russia in reducing nuclear weapons. For example, the INF Treaty, the START 1 Treaty, and the START 2 Treaty. And his pledge is also a way of initiating an arms race between America and Russia. And Russian politicians have been echoing or have been actually saying those almost exact words which I've just come out with just now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm certainly I'm not one of these people who supports Trump come what may. I'm well aware of some of the things that he's said, and I mean we've still got as you know you've got this. He said he's out of the nation building business. We've got the whole involvement in Libya, and we've got the whole NATO boosting of troops in the Russian
Yes,
border.
yes,
But
yes, yeah.
what I meant to say was, okay, the establishment media, let's not get into the whole paradigms of left and right and all that at the minute. Just for even mentioning being possibly, whether he meant it or not, or however it pans out, and you obviously alluded to that he's not consistent. Just the constant demonization of Putin and the neocons or the neoliberals. It's this same war mentality that keeps going on, whether
Yes.
it's CNN or whether it's Fox News. It's the war drums are always beaten. I personally think this is because of the Zionist domination of the U.S. and their foreign policy. The left and the right are both controlled by these lobby groups. That's my opinion of it, and that they unite for their own strategic interests in the region and beyond. What would you say to that?
Well, I would first of all say that Russophobia has a very, very long history. It goes back almost since day one, when London and Moscow established diplomatic relations with each other some 600 years ago. English observers traveling to Russia, English diplomats, etc., looked down upon the Russians with a very strong sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority. So Russophobia quickly became embedded in Whitehall and Westminster. And it was particularly evident during the Crimean War. It was there even during the First World War, even during the Second World War. And of course, it took a grip in America after the Second World War in 1945. Because, of course, the Soviet Union was regarded by America as the ultimate threat to the American way of life and to quotation marks now, freedom in the world. And it never left Washington. It never left Washington even during the 1990s when the Americans, had their man in the Kremlin, so to speak, Boris Yeltsin. It was always there. And it was inevitable that once Russia got off its knees and began to heal the wounds of the 1990s and began to re-establish itself internationally, that the Americans would start to feel threatened, because the Americans are acutely aware that Russia is the greatest threat to America and is the greatest threat to American global dominance. So Russophobia exploded in America some years ago because the American government needs the American people to be on board when it comes to Russia. And so American mainstream media, which is very much a part of the American establishment, began the process of demonizing Russia, began
Maybe the most
process of
important part of it.
demonizing Putin.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, and that explains this unbelievable level of Russophobia in Washington today, and it's because the Americans understand that the Russia of today is not the Russia of the 1990s, and Russia has clawed back, has resurrected a lot of its lost superpower status, and is starting to challenge America on the international stage. And that is a good thing for global peace. That is a good thing for global stability and global security, because you had one superpower in the 1990s and the early 2000s doing what it wanted in the world, in the former Yugoslavia and then in Iraq. Well, today Russia is back. There's no question about it, and Russia is blocking a lot of American moves around the world, and the Americans are frustrated.
It's a threat to their hegemony, isn't it? Really.
So, sorry, say that again, please.
Well, it's a threat to their hegemony, which they really don't like.
Yeah, absolutely. The Americans after the collapse of the Soviet Union, became the sole remaining superpower in the world, and they saw an opportunity to achieve, as you said, American global dominance, and they did that very ruthlessly, and they did that with great success, but at the cost to Russia, of course, because Russia was sidelined by the Americans in the 1990s and the early 2000s. They were humiliated by the Americans, and of course, Yugoslavia was America's first victim in a post-Cold War world. They destroyed that country, and then, of course, you have Iraq and Libya and Syria today. But I think we should be confident and optimistic about Syria, in that the Americans are not going to achieve their objective in Syria, namely the overthrow of President Assad and the Syrian government. That's not going to happen.
Well, again, this is indicative of the rise of Russia, because they are obviously organized and powerful enough to actually to throw a complete spanner in the works to their the neocons and the US agenda in Syria, which is what I wanted to talk to you about, because I mean, we don't have that much time, but there's I want to try and some of our listeners may not know very much at all, Marcus, about the whole conflict in Syria. There are ostensibly complexities to it. You've got a lot of external geopolitical stuff going on. You've got, I mean, the basic. How do we encapsulate this? I mean, we know it's not a war, in Syria. It's a war on Syria. We've got the U.S. interest there trying to overthrow a government basically by backing so-called moderate rebels, which are mercenaries. And then we've got Russia coming in at the invitation of a sovereign government, demonized by the Western media as carrying out war crimes, etc. Then we got Iran coming in. We've got Turkey's interest. I mean, try and break it down as much as you can where we're up to date, because there's been a lot happening there even in the last couple of days.
Yes, it's a very complicated picture, but it can be broken down. Basically, in 2011, the Americans, who are historic opportunists on the international stage, they saw an opportunity in 2011 to back Islamist groups in Syria, to support them to overthrow President Assad and overthrow the Syrian government. Why? Because Syria pursues an independent foreign policy in one of the most strategic parts of the world. Also, Syria is historically Russia's eyes and ears in the Middle East. Syria has very close connections with Iran. And of course, Syria is a firm backer of the Palestinians and a firm backer of Hezbollah. So the Americans and their regional allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also we can include Israel, saw an opportunity to remove an enemy of America, an arch enemy of Israel, to end Russia's influence and power in the Middle East, to end Iranian influence and power in the Middle East, or to decrease Iranian influence and power in the Middle East dramatically, and to eventually destroy Hezbollah by overthrowing the Syrian government. And that is what ultimately this conflict is about. It's a game of chess the Americans and their regional allies are playing, and they have failed because they underestimated the resolve of the Syrian government and the Syrian military. They underestimated the support amongst ordinary Syrians for President Assad and the Syrian government. And also they underestimated the lengths to which Russia and Iran would go to the aid of a very, very dear friend and ally of theirs. And now that the Russian military is in Syria, there is no chance of the Syrian government and President Assad being overthrown. And we should rejoice in that, because the Americans and their regional allies have been backing Islamist terrorists. And let's make that very clear. Not moderate groups, not groups that want democracy and the rule of law and equality, etc., etc. Islamist groups. And the Americans have a long history of supporting Islamist groups,
Yes.
going back to the 1980s with the Mujahideen against the Russians, and then they brought the Mujahideen to Bosnia to fight against the Bosnian Serbs. Then they teamed up again with them in Libya against Colonel Gaddafi, and they're doing it again in Syria now. So we should be supporting 110% the Syrian government and the Syrian army and the Russian military and the Iranian military in fighting not just ISIS, but al-Nusra and the so-called Free Syrian Army, because they are all Islamist terrorist groups who pose a threat not just to the people of the Middle East, not just to the people of North Africa, but Europe and America.
Yes, this, well, as my worldview holds, this Israeli, US, British, Saudi Arabian wrecking ball across the Middle East has kind of been brought to a halt with Russia's intervention in Syria, and I do rejoice in it, because that is a sovereign government, and I'm sick of the brainwashing and the propaganda against it, because we've seen this constant regime change. They call it nation building. I like to call it nation rebuilding after they've flattened each country and put their own people in there.
And then
but
American
we have
companies go in and get the contracts.
Yeah, get and just rebuild it.
Whose infrastructures they've destroyed.
Yeah. It's just imperialism. It's just 21st century style, really. Isn't it?
You took the words out of my mouth. 21st century imperialism, colonialism, and Paul, I want to say something else very quickly, because you made me think of it with what you said just now. I bitterly despise the Saudi government, the Saudi royal family, and I'm very, very open about that. However, they are the legitimate government of Saudi Arabia, and I would never support a war of intervention against them. Yes, action needs to be taken via the United Nations against Saudi Arabia, because they are the leading exporter of Islamic extremism and terrorism to the world. But they are in accordance with international law, and specifically the UN Charter. The Saudi royal family is the legitimate government of Saudi Arabia. So I would never support action being taken, military action being taken against them. And why? Because I fully adhere to international law. Because once you start breaking international law, then you set a very dangerous precedent. And look at the carnage we have in the world today because of what the Americans and their allies have been doing, in particular in the last 25 years, breaking international law for their own political and economic benefits.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, if a country's got difficulties with its own governing powers, that's up to that country to deal with it. We would not like invading armies coming into our country telling us that they wanted to put a different type of governmental system in here, so we shouldn't expect other nations across the world to like it. Even if our own country's in a mess, we're not going to appreciate the Saudi government or the Russians or anybody else coming here and overthrowing our leaders and putting in their so-called democracy. This is the great irony. Democracy spreading is basically removing democratically elected governments, certainly in the case of Syria, and attempting to then put in puppet governments, puppet politicians, as you say, with all the contracts, and they essentially just taking over the country. I think we're going to go to break in about 2 minutes. Do you have 10 minutes on the other side, or do you got to go?
No, of course. 10, 15 minutes, that's no problem. All
right, well, just when the ads kick in, Marcus, probably in about 2-3 minutes, then we'll go to break, and then we'll come back on the other side. Of course, what we have as well, and yesterday at the UN Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, the demonization of Syria has continued. Of course, we've had the great hypocrisy and double standard of calling Iran the biggest, nation of state-sponsored terror. You just outlined the whole
Trump,
history accurately.
That's Trump who said that as well, and his defense secretary.
Yeah, Mattis, and of course, and the no longer Mike Flynn. These war drums were beaten but as I say, and I spent, I think, 2 hours last week or just after that outlining in brief. 2 hours isn't enough to cover it, as you well know, the history of state-sponsored terror by the United States and this alliance that we're talking about,
Yes.
So we have the same rhetoric. A senior member of the Syrian opposition delegation in Geneva has singled out Iran as the biggest obstacle to settling the conflict in Syria. He urged Washington to re-engage in the region and put an end to the interventions of Iran, which has, quote, spread tens of thousands of sectarian fighters. I mean, that is just outright lies.
100% deceit, but then we shouldn't be surprised because the Syrian opposition outside of Syria does not reflect the views of ordinary Syrians, and they are simply just puppets of the Americans, of the Turks, of the Saudis, and of the Qataris. And of course, what do the Americans, the Saudis, and the Qataris in particular have in common with each other? A deep loathing of Iran. So surprise, surprise, the West's proxies regarding Syria have started to come out and say that Iran is the leading exporter of terrorism, the #1 terrorist state, which of course is just preposterous nonsense, but we shouldn't expect anything else from them.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, you're back here live with me, Paul Stevenson, on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com this Friday the 24th, and I am with Marcus Papadopoulos, who is the editor of Politics First magazine. And you with me, Marcus?
Good evening. I'm still here, Paul.
Okay, great. And just what you were talking, we were just talking about Iran and the outright lies here in this the senior member of the Syrian opposition, blah blah blah, and this type of propaganda and BS and tired rhetoric, I believe, is the type of thing and one of the biggest reasons that is causing so many people to switch off from mainstream media. I mean, I talk to so many people, who don't even have a TV anymore because people are just tired of this nonsense. They know it's nonsense.
I think they're becoming increasingly aware that what they're being told is, as you say, nonsense. It's deceit. And all you have to do is take the last 25 years and see how many wars has Iran started? How many countries has Iran invaded? How many countries has Iran bombed? And compare that to how many countries the Americans have invaded or bombed or caused internal conflicts within. Well, of course, I'm not aware of any countries which Iran has invaded or bombed or caused internal chaos in. Let me rephrase that. I'm not aware. They simply have not done that. Let's have a look how many countries have fallen victim to American foreign policy. Well, the former Yugoslavia, of course, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, Syria, and let's not forget poor Yemen as well. Because, how many civilians are dying on a daily basis in Yemen because of that horrific war that Saudi Arabia is waging in that country. And of course, where are Saudi Arabia's weapons coming from? America and Britain. So let's not have any nonsense from these people who attempt to demonize Iran. No, they are the ones who are the demons. They are the ones who are destroying international law. They are the ones who have blood on their hands, and they are the ones who should be in prison.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And again, that's why people are sick and tired of it, because, it's particularly in the case of Iran being the biggest, sponsor of state terror. And as you say, I don't think that Iran have invaded anyone since the 18th century or something. I mean, it's not just a little lie. I mean, it's just an outright, it's just, I'm sick of hearing it, Marcus, and a lot of people are. We've had a lot of stuff happening in Syria in the last couple of days. I want to talk to you about Turkey. Just reading an article here. You probably know Global Research, do you? It's Michael Chozadovsky's website.
Yes.
Turkey poses a bigger threat to Syria than ISIS. ISIS have been defeated in Al-Bab. The defeat may superficially be enjoyed to many readers, but the reality is far from good. In scoring a strategically important victory against ISIS, Turkey and its band of jihadists called the Free Syrian Army have replaced a barbaric terrorist group who seeks the death of the Syrian Arab Republic with the second largest army in NATO, complete with a modern air force. What is going on with Turkey? Are they not supposed to be aligned in an alliance with Russia and Iran, fighting the whole threat to the Syrian government?
Well, of course, Turkey has an immense amount of blood on its hands because of its policy towards the conflict in Syria. Turkey has allowed ISIS al-Nusra, the so-called Free Syrian Army, and all those other Islamist terrorist groups to cross the Turkish-Syrian border whenever they want. Turkey has provided military assistance to these terrorist groups, logistical assistance, intelligence. They have provided training for them in training camps scattered around Turkey, scattered inside Turkey. So the Turks have an immense amount of blood on their hands. However, they made a very, very serious mistake when they shot that Russian bomber down at the end of 2015. And Russia took almost immediate action against Turkey. One of the acts, of course, was economic sanctions on Turkey. There were also other actions the Kremlin took, which is not so well known amongst the ordinary public. And as a result of the decisive action the Russians took against Turkey, Turkey, grovelled for mercy. It was Erdogan who flew to St. Petersburg last year to meet Putin and to beg for his forgiveness. And Russia now has Turkey where it wants it. And yes, the Turks have launched a military incursion into northern Syria, which of course is illegal. It contravenes international law. It violates Syria's independence and sovereignty. And yes, they are backing these different groups, in particular the ones who took al-Bab recently. However, I'm not so concerned about Turkey as I was, say, a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, because I think the Russians have them where they want them now. And I think Erdogan is under an immense amount of pressure, both domestically and internationally. And I think he understands now that his dream of overthrowing Assad is not going to materialize. And that if he tries to pursue it, then he's going to come up against Russia, who simply will not allow that, and Turkey will not win that contest. So yes, Turkey is still allowing terrorists to crisscross the Syrian-Turkish border. Yes, they're still arming them, but I think the level of support to them has decreased rapidly in the last year. So I'm not concerned, as I said, as much as I was about Turkey. I'm certainly not taking my eyes off them, because Turkey is a very devious, very dangerous country.
Ambitious as well, aren't they?
And very, very ambitious. I mean, it's not just in Syria. Let's not forget they launched an illegal military incursion into Iraq last year. Their treatment of the Kurds is absolutely despicable. They played an important role in Libya in 2011 in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. And let's not forget as well that they illegally occupy about a quarter of Cyprus.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's not forget that Turkey is a malignant power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East, and also as well in North Africa. But I think, in regard to Syria, in the Syrian context, I would say the players now we have to pay particular attention to is, of course, America, number one, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I would say this about Trump, that he showed no indication whatsoever so far of wanting to stop American support flowing to those various Islamist terrorist groups in Syria. So let's hold him to that. He kept on saying during his campaign he wants to destroy ISIS, he wants to destroy Islamist terrorism. Well, ball is in his court now. End that support to those groups in Syria.
Yeah, because I mean, they have all this rhetoric about talking about knocking the hell out of ISIS. Well,
Well,
stop. It's not. You would do more for knocking the hell out of ISIS if you just weren't there at all and let people who are actually genuinely actually fighting terrorism in the region instead of in there,
yeah,
supporting, arming, and muddying the waters and confusing issues.
yeah,
And I mean,
yeah.
it's so long as you. I had someone ask me before the show to ask you about Iraq's place in all this. Of course, they seized Mosul airport from
Yes.
ISIS. And where does Iraq intersect in all of this?
Well, let's just give a bit of history to this. Ever since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, which of course was illegal, Iraq and Syria have developed very, very close relations with each other, which of course was not there when Saddam Hussein was in power. And naturally, Iraq has developed very close relations with Iran. And the Iraqi government, ever since 2011, has been steadfast in its support for the Syrian government fighting against Islamist terrorism. And the news that the Iraqi Air Force struck ISIS positions in Syria with the permission of the Syrian government, in coordination with the Syrian government, is very, very positive news, because we need as many genuine partners, as many genuine countries to help the Syrian government fight against ISIS and al-Nusra and the so-called FSA and all the rest of them, because the American coalition operating in the skies above Syria is not legal, because the Syrian government never gave them permission to enter Syrian airspace. And also we have to question just how genuine are they in wanting to fight Islamist terrorism. It is my view that apart from the Syrian military, the only other militaries which are genuine in wanting to destroy all the Islamist terrorist groups in Syria is the Iranian military, is Hezbollah, of course, and now the Iraqi military.
How ironic when you think about it, that they invaded Iraq and now they're another force to be reckoned with in this alliance that is throwing a spanner in the works for their latest target in Syria.
Yes, and also as well, British people should know that the Iranian military is fighting in Syria against groups who want to kill and maim British people in British towns and cities across the UK. That British people should know that, and and at the same time, but unfortunately, Iran is being demonized by, of course, Trump and the rest of them in his administration. And the British government, although it has diplomatic relations with Iran, which is good, and we should be happy about that, it's not doing anything to try and deflect these dreadful attacks that Washington is making, these dreadful political attacks which Washington is making against Iran. And as I said, the irony is that the Iranian military is fighting against people who want to kill British civilians in cold blood, and Iranian soldiers are dying in that fight. And so we really, as British citizens, we really need to ask ourselves this, who is on our side against Islamist terrorism? Is it really the American government and the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris, or is it Russia and is it Iran? Well, the evidence is overwhelming. It is Russia and Iran.
Again, this is why it's the media are such a vital cog in the wheel of this criminal syndicate. I just call it a criminal syndicate when I look at the history and the different aspects of it. To me, it's just, and this warmongering aspect of it is, it's just perpetual war. It doesn't matter who comes in, which government, which administration. The wars continue, and the media, as you say, I mean, we have Iranians protecting British citizens there and protecting the same people from maybe arriving on British soil as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, let's not forget that British mainstream media, American mainstream media, they are part of the British and American governments, respectively. Their job is to demonize a government, demonize a leader who is pursuing an independent foreign policy, who will not bow down to the diktats of Washington, and who maintains close relations with countries that the Americans and the British have serious problems with. For example, Russia, for example, Iran. And after they begin the campaign of demonizing that leader and that government, then, of course, their next job is to make sure that ordinary people in Britain and America are aware of, in quotation marks now, how awful this leader in question is, how awful this government in question is, and to support British and American foreign policy against this government and leader. And then you start hearing about alleged atrocities, then you start hearing about mass murders, then you start hearing about genocide, and that's all for public consumption. That is all to get the British and American public's support for the American government and for the British government. And, we hear about how President Assad, according to the British media and the American media, is waging a murderous, genocidal campaign against Sunnis. Well, number one, that just demonstrates utter ignorance about Syria. Secondly, if President Assad hated Sunnis, why is he married to one? Why has he had children with a Sunni? Why is it that most of the Syrian high command are Sunnis? Why is it that most of the most Syrian infantrymen are Sunnis? And why is it that most of the Syrian population, which of course are Sunni, back the Syrian government? Do you know, it's absolutely preposterous nonsense. It is absolute rubbish.
Yeah, why is it that you had Christians and Muslims, Sunni and Shiites, and Christians of different denominations, and Jews living in that area quite peacefully, not dissimilar to how peacefully they were living together. And a lot of, I think, Christian Zionists don't appreciate this, that in Palestine there was Jews and Christians and Muslims living there, predominantly I think Muslims, but there was no tension really.
Look, going back to the 1960s, in Syria, the Sunnis and the Alawites, they made an agreement with each other that the Sunnis would be responsible for the Syrian economy and the Alawites would be responsible for the government. And that agreement has worked very, very well for Syria. So this lie being peddled and put out by America and Britain that it's a sectarian war in Syria really is simply deceit.
And a strategy for their own agenda.
Oh, it's a strategy for their own agenda. But if you talk to any historian of Syria, any expert on Syria, they will just say, well, that doesn't correspond with reality of Syria. And how many of these Western journalists intimately know Syria? I mean, we can draw a parallel with Yugoslavia in the 1990s. These Western journalists, they were filing article after article about what was happening in Croatia and in Bosnia, and they projected themselves as authorities on Yugoslavia. Well, they knew nothing about Yugoslavia. Before the war started there, most of them had never travelled to Yugoslavia. None of them knew how complex that country was. It was a mosaic of different religions and different cultures. And we see the same in Syria today. They do not understand the history of Syria. They do not understand the makeup of Syria. And yet they project themselves as authorities, and they cause terrible, or they help to contribute terrible damage to Syria, and of course ultimately to Syrian people.
Yeah, it's just tragic, really, and we can only try in shows like this, and and other alternative networks, and and obviously RT is good as well to make people aware, and so there's no support domestically for this. Just before I let you go, we're coming up to the hour, I suppose, and thanks for staying with me. Do you think that they will sooner or later attempt to overthrow the Iranian government, and if so, will Russia continue to align with Iran? And if so, could you see a bigger World War III conflict emerge from all of this?
No, I don't believe there will be a World War III, though, of course, you can never say never, but I think that is extremely unlikely. Will Russia distance itself from Iran? No chance. The alliance which is coming together, or indeed it can be argued has been formed between Russia, Iran, and Syria, and perhaps Iraq will become a part of that alliance.
It's starting to look like it.
It's starting to look like that. Is strategic and is long term, and nothing is going to break that. Now, in regard to America and Iran, well, Tehran is used to threatening and antagonistic language coming out of Washington. They've been used to that almost since day one of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Now we have Trump in the White House. The Americans, or America, is going to revert back to a very, very hostile policy regarding Iran. And even though I bitterly disliked Obama, we do have to pay him credit. He pursued a more progressive policy towards Iran, and we do have to pay him credit for that. Now with Trump there, Iran needs to be extra cautious, which of course they have a lot of experience in doing. But I still don't believe there will be a war between America and Iran. However, I believe the possibility of American subversion in Iran is a distinct possibility of them trying to use various groups in Iran to try and bring down the Iranian government. I think that the Trump administration could try to severely weaken, disable the Iranian economy as another way of trying to bring down the Iranian government. So while I don't think there will be a military conflict between Washington and Tehran, I think we need to be very alert to the possibility of the Americans trying to cripple the Iranian economy, trying to bring down the Iranian government through subversion.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, maybe a similar type sort of proxy war arming militia groups and mercenary groups in the area to destabilize and that type of thing. Well, but you're looking at an alliance now with the people we've just been talking about who are wise to this. They know what's going on. They've a good experience in Syria now. So I can't, I think it could be checkmate here for the Russian alliance.
I'm with you. I think that is the case. I think it shows all the evidence of becoming a very firm, long-term alliance, and it's difficult to see how the Americans can be successful here, unless they are able to bring down the Iranian government, for example, through subversion, and if, for example, they place, hypothetically speaking, more sanctions on Russia, which of course is what Congress wants, and I wouldn't be surprised if James Mattis, the American Defense Secretary, would support that, because that would hurt the Russian economy. The Russian economy since 2014 has taken quite a blow because of the sanctions, but at the same time it's provided an opportunity for the Russian domestic market. A lot of the things that Russia has been importing.
Marcus, we're just going to break. If you want to come back in 5 minutes on the other side to wrap up for 5 minutes, and we can give out your Facebooks and your YouTubes if you want to do that.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, you're back with me, Paul Stevenson, here on live on Revolution Radio this Friday, the 24th of February. I'm with Marcus Papadopoulos. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Marcus?
Oh, you're pronouncing it perfectly.
A Greek name, obviously.
It certainly is.
Do you go back to Greece much?
Well, actually, my dad was from Cyprus. My mum was born in England. She's half German and half English. But I've been to Cyprus and Greece many times, but the last time I was there was many, many years ago.
And you're based in London, correct?
I am, yes.
Okay, I think you're the first person I've spoken to in the UK, believe it or not, on this show for a long time. I always tend to, speaking to people in the US. I was speaking to a guy last week in South Korea, so it's refreshing to actually speak to someone in the same country. Because I'm up about, I'm in a little place called Mildenhall. It's about half hour from Cambridge.
Right. Okay. No, I don't know that. Right. That's very interesting to hear.
Although I lived in London for 16 years, but I'm here at the moment. I'll probably end up back in London. Once you've been there for a long time, it's difficult to sort of adapt to anywhere else in the UK. But all right, so we were just talking about, it could be checkmate in this area with the alliance, and we were also talking about unless the economic pressures in Russia. And do you think this is the reason for the NATO build-up and the pressure on Europe to force around the Russian border to force them into an almost like neo-Cold War situation to drain their finances and the economy of the country? Or
I think first and foremost, NATO, under the leadership, of course, of America, who is the de facto leader of NATO, and that's indisputable, is attempting to place a cordon sanitaire on Russia's western borders, because by weakening Russia in Europe, that will ultimately weaken Russia globally. And the missing piece for the complete encirclement on the western borders of the Russian Federation is, of course, Ukraine. And that is what that is the reason why the Americans and the British are striving towards bringing in Ukraine into NATO. All you need to do is to take out a map of modern-day Europe and look on the borders, the western borders of Russia, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You will see that Russia's western border is littered with NATO member states, with the exception of Ukraine. And if Ukraine was to join NATO, then that would complete the encirclement of Russia on its western borders, and that would severely weaken Russia politically, economically, and militarily, because the NATO threat to Russian national security would be tremendously increased. And that is why Russia simply cannot and will not countenance Ukraine joining NATO. But I think in regard to the Russian economy, it is true that the Russian economy has suffered a lot because of the Western sanctions. However, two things. Number one, those sanctions have provided an opportunity for the Russian domestic market to start producing products, to start producing goods that Russia should never have been importing in the first place.
Absolutely.
So that is a plus for the Russian economy. And secondly, Russia is historically accustomed to threats. They have overcome challenges which, in my opinion, no other people in the world would have overcome. They overcame Nazi Germany at a terrible cost. Of course, 27 million Soviet people perished in the Great Patriotic War, which of course is what the Russians call the Second World War. But nonetheless, they destroyed the Wehrmacht. They destroyed Nazism. And we even have to say about Churchill, though it was a post-war comment, he did say that it was the Russian army that tore the guts out of the German war machine. So, we are here today, you and I, Paul, are having this discussion today because of the sacrifices of the Red Army, of the Soviet people in general. So, yes, those sanctions are damaging the Russian economy, but the Russian people have extraordinary levels of resilience.
Well, they overcame a lot more than that in the 20th century.
Well, exactly. But, I always come back to this, Paul. If they can overcome Nazi Germany, which they did, they can overcome anything. And yes, the Russian economy is suffering because of those sanctions, but they can overcome it. All I would say is this: Congress in America wants to place more sanctions on Russia. That is a distinct possibility. And without a doubt, the Kremlin would have been, will have been, and is continuing to plan for that eventuality if it does happen. But if it does, the Russians will overcome that again. I'm quite certain of that.
Well, I mean, you may differ. I don't know you well enough, but they overcame Bolshevism as well. And again, you may have a different view on that, but they overcame the whole communist movement in Russia. But you may think that was a good thing, do you? I don't know.
Well, look, do you know?
I don't want to get into it too much, but
no, of course. I mean, all I'd say is that no system is perfect. No government is perfect. Yes, there were a lot of injustices when Russia was communist. However, there were great achievements. Great progress was made. You know, one of the reasons that the Red Army didn't collapse in the Second World War, like the Imperial Russian Army collapsed in the First World War, is because of the industrialization that Stalin carried out in the 1930s, because it meant that there was an armaments industry capable of constantly supplying the Red Army. And that is a big factor for the Red Army's victory in the Second World War. And also there were other achievements. And, you know, President Putin and other senior Russian leaders in his government, in his administration, are very, very proud of the Soviet past and of their Soviet heritage.
It's a better Russia now, though, I'm sure you would agree.
You know, there are some things which are positive. However, there are a lot of things, for example, about regarding education, regarding health, which do worry me about what's happening in Russia and worry a lot of ordinary Russians. But, you know, communism came, communism collapsed. It brought a lot of great things for Russia. Also, there were problems with it, like there were problems when Russia was Tsarist as well. Let's not forget about that. But, you know, history works in phases, and today it's still a new Russia we're dealing with, a Russia which is proud of its Tsarist past and is proud of its communist past. And, you know, that's the way a country should be, in my opinion.
Okay, so this, as we just said, the US and the NATO under the Trump administration, US-NATO buildup, there's been an escalation of it. I think Germany, Canada, and our country here, in the 3 Baltic states have added 1,000 troops in each case. Yeah. And we've just broken down what we think that might be about. If, you know, demonization aside from Western media, which we are obviously totally on the same page with, and probably most of our listeners are as well, taking that out of the equation, there's a lot of popularity at the minute for Putin in the West. A lot of people obviously not believing this BS in mainstream media. Is there any possibility that it's maybe too positive? I mean, if we took NATO away from there, is there any genuine threat from Russia coming into those Baltic states again, like we've seen last century?
You know, Russia has suffered terribly because of wars, and indeed it was Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, who once said that Russians truly understand what war is about. Of course, he was referring to the 27 million Soviet people who died in the Second World War. But also you can go back to the First World War. You can talk about Napoleon's invasion of Russia and how many Russians died because of that. Charles XII of Sweden, his invasion of Russia, which caused many, many Russian deaths. So there is no threat from Russia, but Russia has a right to national security, like any other country does in the world. And Russian national security is threatened by NATO's presence on Russia's borders, and also by the American missile defense system, which went live last year and is partly in Poland and partly in Romania. And that's what we have to, or that's what Western politicians and journalists need to understand, and they need to have empathy as well. How would the Americans, for example, like it if on their doorstep, let's say Canada or Mexico, there was a Russian-led military alliance? How would they like that? Well, they wouldn't tolerate it. Look what they did when the Russians deployed ICBMs to Cuba in 1962, there was nearly a nuclear war. So they wouldn't like that on their borders. So why should Russia have to accept NATO and a missile defense shield on its borders?
Well, this is the great double standard. You're seeing the same thing in the South China Sea, of course.
Of course, yes.
It's just, it goes on and on. Anyway, we'll wrap up there. I'll let you go, Marcus. Just give out your Facebook page and your YouTube and your website.
Yes. You might have asked me a question now I can't answer. I'm not too sure if I can remember my exact names on there, but I mean, if
I think Marcus Papadopoulos is just your Papadopoulos is your YouTube channel, and then your magazine is Politics First magazine.
Yes, Politics First, and I'm pretty sure on Twitter I'm Dr Marcus P. But if someone wanted to find me on Twitter, they can just type in Marcus Papadopoulos, and they should be able to find me that way.
Yeah, and you've been pretty busy recently on media. I saw you in the. I was actually amazed that the BBC let you on to say what you said. I was watching this and I was thinking, sorry, am I hearing things? How did you get on there to be able to say what? Did you dupe them?
No, nothing to do with me. That was BBC Breakfast, and last year I was on BBC News as well, talking about Syria and the White Helmets. And I've given various interviews to BBC Radio 5 Live. Of course, I haven't been on at prime time. I'm not on regularly, but we should welcome, and I certainly welcome the opportunity to go on to the BBC and to offer my opinions. And I have to say, so far, my experience of going on the BBC is that the producers and the presenters who have been interviewing me, they've been very professional, they've been very courteous, respectful, they haven't interrupted me, haven't been hostile. So we should recognise that, but at the same time, I haven't been on prime time, for example, 5 p.m. Or 9 p.m. or say 9 o'clock in the morning. I have been on at something like 3 p.m. or most recently at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not invited on there regularly. But when I'm invited on, I will always say yes, because it is so important to put out there the other side to the story, be it Syria, be it Ukraine, be it Russia, be it Libya. And as you're doing on your show, Paul, you are putting out the other side to the story. You are challenging the Western narrative, either put out by Western politicians or Western journalists, and we must all keep on doing that. Every little helps, and it contributes ultimately to exposing the dangers of Western foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, I think, there is hope because of Russia. I mean, a lot of people around the world, and, and Russia recognizes, and Putin himself has said, he just wants, a healthy balance of power in the world, as opposed to, I think people across the world are just sick and tired of this US, Anglo-American, Israeli hegemony. And they've got the inevitable pushback. They don't have the right to rule the world, even though they think they do.
Yes. The Americans regard themselves as the policemen of the world. Well, no, I'm sorry. That job is falls to the United Nations, and America must never be allowed to become the policeman of the world, like it was in the 1990s. That was a terrible time for international law and global peace and security, as was, of course, the early 2000s when Iraq was invaded.
Yeah. All right, Marcus. Well, it was a pleasure having you on. It was very enlightening. I hope it was helped our listeners. And again, thank you for coming on, and good luck in your work. And we'll keep in touch, and we'll hopefully get you on again, and we can keep in touch and update as we go.
I'd be delighted to. And once again, Paul, thank you very much for having invited me on your program, and keep on exposing Western foreign policy for what it is.
Will do, Marcus. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.